Hi everyone, this is Anna Hosseini. On today's episode, we have Rob Frank here, and I can't believe I convinced him to be on here today. So he's going to talk about a little about his journey and some of the struggles that him and his family have faced. So thank you so much for being here today.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where you come from.
So I grew up northeast of Pittsburgh, a town called Sarver. It's a small farm town, farm community, small school. I graduated in 2001, came to Erie, went to Penn State Behrend, got a communications degree, started my business, and here we are 17 years later. I own R. Frank Media.
So tell me about your family, not just your current family, but like where you actually come from, your siblings.
So I have two sisters, Jen and Lisa. My parents, they both grew up outside of Pittsburgh. My mom was from New Kensington. My dad was from what is the North Shore now of Pittsburgh. They both grew up there, met there, got married, had our kids, and we're kind of all over now. My one sister still lives in Pittsburgh. My other one lives in Michigan, and my mom still lives in Pittsburgh as well.
Mm-hmm. And do you have kids right now?
I do. I have a daughter and a son. Emma is 8 and Tyler's 6.
Cool. So how exactly did you get into, obviously, like filming and?
Early on, I remember when I had to been like 9 or 10. I don't know. I took my mom's Polaroid camera and like wasted all of her film, took photos of trees, and I remember she was so mad because it was probably expensive. I don't know. I mean, I was taking photos of random stuff like trees and buildings, and that's like the first time I held a camera, and then I've always had cameras since then. My dad brought home it was called a Kodak Easy Share, was what it was, like a point and shoot camera. And that was like the second camera I ever had. And then in college, there was a sale there was a camera store in the mall. I think it was Ritz Camera maybe. They had a Nikon D70 with like a lens, and it was on sale, and I ended up buying it. And that was the first like semi-professional camera. It was still a consumer camera, but the first time I'd leaned into something like toward a professional level. And after I graduated, the job market wasn't the greatest in 2006. Sort of leaned in. It was starting to lean into the recession that would come in a few years. Mm-hmm. So I started my business, and I was actually working at a bar. I was working at the Plymouth Tavern downtown as a bar back and a server and a door person, and I washed dishes too, and kind of just did that and ran the business at the same time.
And so is this something that you feel like your parents supported all the time? Because I know when you get into like filming, it's kind of like a vision that you gotta see through, and it's all like your success is based off like your own will.
My dad was an engineer. My older sister is a very successful engineer, and my younger sister has a career in management of information systems. So, to be totally honest, I don't know exactly what she does on her day-to-day, but I know that's what it's tied to. I originally was an engineering major. And I ended up dropping out my fall semester of my second year. I probably could have done the core work, but I had no motivation to do it. If I'm being honest, it wasn't the right job for me, and I thought it was. I thought that's what I wanted to be, and I think I lied to myself that I could do that job, and I think I did that probably because my dad was an engineer, my older sister was an engineer, and that's actually why I went to Behrend, because it's a really good engineering school. But I remember calling home and saying, like, I want to drop out. Like, I think I was failing 3 classes. I didn't even have the motivation to go to class. Like, I didn't want to do it, and that's when I realized that it wasn't my path. So I called home and I told my parents, like, I want to drop out. I want to come home. And I thought they'd be like really upset, and they actually weren't at all. Really supportive. And so I came home and figured it out. I worked at a Sears, worked as a cashier at a Sears. Re-enrolled the next semester, so I came back that spring. So I only had a couple months off, but that couple months was, I figured out a lot of things, and I switched to communications and media studies because I always had a drive for photo, and I loved movies, and I loved film, and I loved storytelling, and all of that, and I didn't really have any experience in it besides an amateur, like what I taught myself. I mean, students now, a lot of schools have TV studios and content creation and cameras and equipment, and you can like learn all that stuff. And when I was in high school, it just wasn't as available as it is now, and it's awesome, actually. I think for the career that I'm in. I mean, you have so many kids that are creating content. They're 14 years old, 15 years old, and they're using the tools they have, the cell phone they have, or the lights they have in their house, and they're figuring it out. So when they get to a professional level, they actually have more knowledge than I think they realize they do. And even I teach at the collegiate level, I find that my students understand the concepts pretty quickly, and I think it's because they know it. They just don't realize they know it until you start to educate them on it, and then it all sort of just connects.
And so you're obviously the man behind the camera when it comes to making all my other episodes, and I noticed that your eyes, they speak a lot of volume in terms of after interviews. I just look at you and I could tell you're impacted. A lot of times that tells me that there's this underlying pain and just emotions that you're feeling, and that's what kind of got me to ask, like, what's your story? Like, why is there so much pain? And so if you don't mind, talking and opening up a little bit about something that you've dealt with.
So my dad passed away from Alzheimer's in 2017, August 17th of 2017, and that was coming up on 6 years ago, which is, that seems like some days it feels like it was yesterday, and other days it feels like it was eons ago. And his mother passed away from Alzheimer's, my grandmother. I was very young when that happened. I want to say I was 5 or 6. I'm not really sure how old I was, 5 or 6 maybe. So it runs in our family. There's a good possibility I could be afflicted by that disease. There's a possibility my sisters could be afflicted by that disease. Statistically, between the three of us, numbers don't look great, So, it's one of those things that's kind of always in the back of your mind. My dad officially was diagnosed, I think he was 71. And he was officially diagnosed at 71, but we noticed that something wasn't right earlier. And I want to say it was in his mid-50s, even before he retired. I'd catch him doing things, repeating the same thing twice. Or I remember one time we were working, we had a bigger property, and old farm property, and my dad loved to cut paths in the woods and take down trees, and we had a big burn pile, and every Saturday we would split wood because we had a fireplace. So we had all these like chores, and him and I were chopping up. We had drug a big tree that had fallen down across the path, drug it down, and we were slicing it up to burn it, and ran out of gas in the chainsaw. And he's like, I'll go get the can. The can was up at the garage, and we were all the way across the way. So he walked up to the garage, and he came back, and he didn't have the gas can. I said, Dad, did you get the gas can? Yeah, I'll go get that. And and this happened 3 times. And every time by the time he got to the garage, he could not remember, or his mind meandered or something, but he forgot the gas can. And the 3rd time he came back, he looked at me and he realized he forgot the gas can. And it was kind of like one of the last times that he worked outside or worked with his hands, really. I know he worked with his hands a little bit after that, but I think that, I don't know if that moment of clarity kind of like made him realize that, 1, something was wrong, and 2, maybe he shouldn't be working with these kinds of things, right? And it was kind of scary for me because, here I am using a chainsaw with my dad, and like he can't remember a gas can that he walked 100 yards for. So, you look at your parents, they're always that young, spry, they can do anything, they're your parents. And suddenly had to face a reality that not only is this disease definitely affecting him, but that it's going to take him the way it took his mom. So.
And so, you talk about certain experiences and how it's affected you, just like that. Like, talk about your mental, like even your mental health. That obviously you probably didn't really give yourself an opportunity to feel, just dealing with someone, like living with someone who has Alzheimer's, and just watching them being stripped of all their memories.
Well, I mean, I will say that I didn't really live with my dad when he was in the throes of the disease when it was really bad. My mom was his primary caretaker, and for the most part, she really shielded us from him. And I think she just wanted us to remember our dad not that way. And it's really tough. It's one of those things when you're in those shoes. I think everybody looks at other people's choices and they say, "Oh, well, I would have done this, or I would have done that." And I don't think you know what choices you make until you're in those shoes, and it's really difficult. And my mom was a primary caregiver, and she struggled with that a lot. I know it was really difficult on her, but I think she saw it as that was part of her job. They got married, better or worse, right? So that's what that phrase means when you say for better or worse. It's not small things. It's for better or worse. You're together and you're a team. And I remember it took her a long time to admit that she needed some home health care, and she finally got a nurse toward the end that would come in a couple days a week, and it gave my mom a breath to go to the store and just probably feel a little bit of a normal life. And I think it was pretty tough for her. I didn't get to see him at his worst, really. I saw him toward the end in a nursing home, and that was really difficult. And then, of course, when he passed, he was hospitalized at the time. And he spent the last 4 or 5 days hospitalized. So.
And so you talk about like how you remember him. What would you say how would you describe like the happiest memory you have with your dad?
There's so many of them. I mean, we used to tinker in the garage a lot, and he would have a maintenance. I mean, he had these maintenance schedules. He had this book. He had this journal, and in the journal it was like he would mark down oil changes, blade rotations, tire rotations, sharpening, anything that broke, how he fixed it. He just had this logbook of stuff, and he'd flip back a couple months and see, okay, well, I changed the oil in here and here and here, so let's do these today. And he hurt his back in the late 80s, and they said he loved working on cars, and they told him he really probably couldn't roll under vehicles anymore. So because my dad never liked to do anything small, we cut a 6-foot pit in our garage, and we put like a service pit in our garage that you could stand under the car, just like if you pull into like a Jiffy Lube or any of those stations, literally a pit under the car so that we could stand and work on them. And I remember we'd do oil change days. We'd change like all 4 cars' oil in like an hour, just swapping them out, And he loved toys. We had a backhoe. We had a front loader that he built by himself, and just all this. He would make things work. He'd love to build. He'd love to fix. He'd love to figure things out. And those memories of being in the garage with him is probably the best ones.
And so you said that he was hospitalized the last few days before passing away. Is there anything that, like a conversation, something that you lived day by day with his saying, like anything he left you with?
The Sunday before, he passed on Thursday, and the Sunday before, my mom was like, hey, you need to get down here. They don't think he's going to make it through the night. So that was really hard to hear. I mean, we knew it was coming, and grief's a weird thing, right? I mean, for years, I was preparing for the time when my dad would eventually succumb to this disease that has been slowly taking him away. And, you think you are ready. You think you're able to prepare for that. And you're not. You're not at all. And I remember walking down the hallway of the hospital, and I'm still thinking he's, this is it, right? And I'm walking down the hallway, and he always called me Bobby. That was his name for me. And the hallway at that hospital, it's a straight line, then it bends like 30 degrees. And they were in the corner room, so you could see from his bed, you could see straight down the hallway. And he said, "What's Bobby doing here?" And he was really normal. I mean, really normal. I walked in. He asked where Becca was. He asked where my wife was. He knew about Emma, my daughter. He didn't really know about my son, Tyler, because Tyler was born. He was really, really far into the disease. He died in 2017. My son was born the year prior. So, and he knew that my daughter was named after his mom, who had passed from Alzheimer's. So he was really lucid and really with it. And so I called his best friend, and I said, "Hey, my dad's really with it right now. I don't know. This might be the last time you ever get to talk to him." So it was like midnight, and I called him. I handed him the phone. I think he probably thought I was calling to give him some bad news. But I handed the phone, and he would always greet him. His name was Richard Sherrod, and my dad would always say, "Hello, Richard, how are you?" And he would always say it like that on the phone, and he said it just like that. And had a conversation with him and told him that he was going to be out of the hospital in a few days and everything was fine. And Dick told him, "Well, I have chemo on Wednesday, but I'll be up on Thursday." And my dad made it. Dick got there around noon, and my dad passed around 2:30 in the afternoon. So he made it.
And you told me about your tattoo that you have.
Yeah, so ironically, my dad hated tattoos, which is funny. He was, old school 50s guy, right? So tattoos are bad, and long hair is bad, and all that stuff. But I only have one tattoo. I hate needles, so it's not very big, and it's right on my arm, but it's mine, and it says YDGGRN, 6 letters in 2x3. And it means "you did great, go rest now." And it's the last thing that Dick said to my dad before he passed. So I try to tell that story as much as I can. But it's nice because I have it here and it's hidden. So if I feel like somebody deserves to hear the story or understands where I'm coming from, that's why it's there. So I can easily show it if I want to. When you lose somebody, I don't know if you've ever lost anybody in your life. I don't know if you've experienced that yet. I hope you haven't. But if you have, you find out, you call, you text, you send flowers, you send your condolences in some way. You go to a viewing, maybe a wake or a funeral. You check in a couple times, and then, life returns to normal for you. But for the person that lost somebody, it doesn't. And for some people, that process is short, and for other people it's really long, and for some people it's lifelong. And I think that people don't understand grief, and I don't think it's that they don't want to understand grief. They probably just haven't experienced it, which is really a good thing. It's kind of a blessing. I remember reading or hearing somewhere a description of grief, and I wish I remember where I heard it from, but it was described as like being in the surf, and you're standing knee high in the water, and the waves are coming in, and when you first walk in, that first wave hits your legs, and you haven't been in the water yet, and you stumble and you fall, and you get up, and the second wave's coming, and you kind of like spread your legs a little bit and kind of dig your toes in the sand and get a grip, right? Shift your body weight, and that wave hits you, and it kind of pushes you a little bit, but you fight back against it, and then the third wave comes, and the third wave you've dug in a little more, and you're adjusting your position, and by the fifth and the sixth and the seventh wave that's hitting you, now they're not affecting you at all. They're just passing right by you because you're used to them smacking into your legs, right? And you're able to just freely walk through the surf, walk right across. The waves can hit you no problem, and you're just continuing to enjoy the surf, and then that rogue wave hits. That one that is a different angle, different way, different time, different speed. Something triggers it, created by something else, like a ship, and it hits you like you've never been in the surf ever before, and you fall, and it's like you've never dealt with it before. You've never dealt with this pain. You've never experienced it ever, and then you get back up, and the whole process starts again. And that's the best description of grief I've ever heard. Because that's what it's like. And those waves, when you translate that to the real world, with the surf, the waves are they're constant, every 5 seconds. Yeah. With grief, they can come later. in the weirdest of times. I still have trouble talking about this 6 years later. I still have trouble thinking about it 6 years later. And a couple months after he passed, I was in my car and a song came on the radio. And I don't even remember what song it was, but I couldn't drive a car anymore. And I don't know if I started thinking about my dad because of the song or I don't know what it was, but I couldn't drive a car anymore. I had to pull over on the side of the road and couldn't drive a car. Like I couldn't feel like I could operate a car. And I sat there for, I don't know, 5 or 6 minutes, and I got through it. And suddenly I had this realization of what PTSD is like, right? Never experienced that before in my life, ever, right? So I was sitting there on the side of the road on my way to work, and I was just sitting there in the car for like 6 minutes, and I managed to get through it, and I don't know. It was so weird. And, I think that when you talk about mental illness and you talk about grief and you talk about those things, they're so interconnected with each other. And I think so many people say things like, are you okay? And I think people don't realize that's not the question that you need to ask. It's obvious you're not okay. It's the question you need to ask is, how can I help? What can I do? Can I call somebody? And, a lot of the times the answer to those questions is no, but people understanding that is huge. And grief is weird, it's a fickle thing that can hit you at any time, and it can change who you are. It can change how you approach things. It can change what you want to experience.
And so you talked about like mental health and like grieving and all that. And you talked about how it kind of runs in the family. So do you feel like you live with like a day-to-day fear that one day this will hit you?
I mean, I don't see how I can't live with a day-to-day fear of it. I mean, especially with 2 sisters. We all have kids. My older sister has 3 kids. My younger sister has 2. We have 2. My dad, I think my dad was in his late 50s when the disease first started. And I want to say that I first started noticing things when he was 56 or 57. He died when he was 79. So I think he lived with it for almost 20 years. I really do. And that's the problem with Alzheimer's is early on, when the disease first starts, it's very subtle. And the average diagnosis for Alzheimer's is 7 years, but many patients suffer long before that. They just don't know, or they're too scared to admit it. So the track of Alzheimer's is very large. It says 7 years on paper because that's when people get diagnosed. And even my dad was 7 years. He was diagnosed, I think he was 71 or 72, and he died when he was 79. So he's right in that window of 7 years. But I noticed things long before that. I mean, long, long before that. Yeah. So it's not... It's just it's a tough disease, and it's hard not to think. I'm 40 years old. It's hard not to think, do I have 16 years left? Do I start to decline faster? I've heard stories of people starting to, MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment, in their late 40s. We just were at the Alzheimer's Summit, and one of the keynote speakers was a radio DJ in California. His last name was Gonzalez, and I can't even remember his first name. I want to say he's in his late 40s, and he's been diagnosed with MCI. He told a story about how he was driving home from the radio station, and he couldn't find his house. Wow. He just couldn't find his house. And, it's scary. It's scary for me, but it's also scary for my kids. I mean, my kids don't know this, but my daughter's 8, my son's 6. If I've got 16 years left, my daughter will be 24, my son will be 22, If I progress into the disease the way my dad did, my son and daughter will be in their mid-30s, exactly like I was in the mid-30s trying to deal with their father declining, right? The only difference is that I'll be younger than my dad was at the time. Right. So I don't know. It's really kind of difficult. And you try to remain positive because, I mean, everything happens for a reason. I mean, I really do believe that. And there's been a lot of advancements in the last few years, there's a lot of promise, but this disease is one of those ones. You think about like cancer treatments and heart disease. There's so many advancements in cancer treatments from 20 years ago. There's so many advancements in slowing heart disease, stopping heart disease, the surgeries they can do to save people. Alzheimer's, there's not a lot of promise there. There is now, actually fairly recently, with some new drugs on the market and new therapies and new opportunities. But, you know, Alzheimer's progression and Alzheimer's effects on others is largely the same as it was 20 years ago. And that's not true for almost every disease out there, if you think about it, really. I mean, almost every single disease out there, we've found ways to battle it better. And Alzheimer's, we really haven't.
And so, obviously, you know that I conclude every single interview with a question. And you talked a lot about your mom, and you talked a lot about how she experienced it all firsthand. And when it got really bad, she shielded you from it. And so if she was in this room today and you just had to give her a piece of your heart, what would you tell her?
You know, she did what she thought was right. That's all we ever can do. I mean, all we can do is make choices. And I think it's really easy for others everywhere to say, well, I would have done this, I would have done that, I would have taken this road, I would have done this, said this. And until you're in those shoes, man, you don't know. You know, and I would like to think that I wanted to see my dad more. I wanted to see him more, and I know she didn't want me to. I know she didn't want us to see him, and we had talked about that before he passed, and then I think I wanted to see him, but I think I didn't want to see him like that. I still can see him in that wheelchair in the nursing home. First time I'd seen him in, I think it was almost a year, and he was in a wheelchair, and he looked at me and started crying, and he couldn't even talk. I mean, he wasn't nonverbal, but he couldn't even talk, and that particular day was a pretty bad day. I mean, there's my dad in a wheelchair, just looking off into space. The guy that like could build anything. My mom used to say that my dad could fix anything but a broken heart or a rainy day. And I remember walking into that nursing home and seeing him in this chair, just sitting there, just almost helpless, just not him. And I think at that moment I kind of realized why my mom shielded us and why she wanted us not to see him that way, because it was tough to see. That wasn't him at all. It was really tough to see. And then, like I mentioned earlier, 4 days before he passes, totally normal. And actually, to finish that story, because I didn't finish that story, I called his best friend. They talked on the phone, said he'd be up. My dad hung the phone up. He was on morphine at the time. He fell asleep. So I was sitting there. I decided to stay in the hospital, and this was all pre-COVID, so you could sit there, you know. And I was very fortunate. My friend Dan Lucy lived across the street. Him and his wife, Jackie, lived across the street at the time from the hospital. So I called him on the way down, and I said, do you have a spare bedroom? And he said, yeah, I do. And I was like, I need to occupy it for a few days. So he left me a spare key and was like, come and go as you need to. Our house is your house. So I was able to be across the street from the hospital. And my parents didn't live very far from that hospital, but being across the street was really great. I mean, that was awesome that I could just come straight across. So I'm sitting there with him. He falls asleep, and he woke up about an hour later, and he looked at me, and I could tell he didn't know who I was. I could just tell by the way he looked at me, staring at me with these blank eyes. I said, do you know who I am? And he said, no, I don't know who you are. You look like my dad, but you're too young to be him. And I said, I'm your son. And he's like, I don't have a son. I was like, yeah, you do, Dad. You have a son and you have 2 daughters. I said, no, I don't. I'm not even married. I don't have any kids. I'm like, you do. And he was definitely like in and out. And he fell asleep, and that was the last time I spoke to him. After that, you know, the progression dropped pretty quickly. He never spoke again, at least not that I'm aware of. He just slowly slipped away from there. So I did get one last interaction with him.
Have you ever called him?
Yeah, I called him once. It was really weird. I forget what it was about. But I picked the phone up to call him. It was a technical question. Mm-hmm. And I picked up the phone, and I was like, he's not going to be there. You know, and that reality. And then you talk about that grief. Mm-hmm. You know, those waves of grief, right? Try and call your parent that's deceased. You know, talk about a wave of grief hitting you. That'll be one right there. Yeah.
And so to wrap this up, I just want to conclude and let everybody in the audience, whoever's listening, watches this, let you guys know that this is the man behind my vision. He truly took, as soon as I picked up the phone one day and told him, I want to make this happen, you were like, let's go, let's do it. You don't got to talk to nobody else. Like, I'll take care of this for you. And so from me to you, I appreciate you so much. My family appreciates you so much. My parents appreciate you so much. And one day I'll do the same for somebody else as you've done for me.
Good.
So thank you.
That's all you can do.
Yeah.
It's not just me, though. You know, and, we got Megan behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. We got Jason behind the scenes. We've had Jesse behind the scenes. We've had, I'm trying to think who else, Steve behind the scenes. There's been so many people that have worked on these 4 or 5 ones we've done. But also, like, you got to remember that, yeah, we pulled in the lights and the cameras and ran the cabling and got it all set up. But ultimately, you have to pull this out of people, and that's not easy to do. It's definitely a skill, and you should be really proud of what you've achieved and what you've been able to do with these. I mean, a lot of people talk about, I want to produce this, I want to make this, but actually sitting down and doing it, it's a different thing. So you should be proud of yourself.
Appreciate that. Thank you.